The night began like countless others, quiet enough to make the ticking clock sound louder than it should. No one noticed when the lights in the small apartment went dark, and no one heard the moment when an ordinary evening turned into a nightmare. By the time the first call reached emergency services, whatever had happened inside those walls was already over. What investigators would later find there would haunt them for years, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it was disturbingly precise. This was the kind of crime that made seasoned professionals pause, reread their notes, and ask the same question over and over again. Who could do something like this? And why? The victim was a young professional named Daniel Harper, known among friends as dependable, private, and predictable. He lived alone, kept a strict routine, and rarely missed work. When Daniel failed to show up on a Monday morning and didn't answer his phone, his supervisor assumed he was sick. By the afternoon, concern replaced patience. A welfare check was requested, and a patrol unit was dispatched to Daniel's apartment complex, a neat row of buildings that looked too calm to be hiding anything sinister. The door was locked from the inside. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. When officers finally gained access, the silence inside felt heavy, almost deliberate. Daniel was found in the living room. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no chaos. Instead, the scene was chilling in its order. Investigators would later describe it as controlled, a word that made the reality even more unsettling. Forensics quickly confirmed what was already obvious. Daniel had been murdered. The cause of death was clear enough, but the manner raised immediate questions. This was not a crime of rage. There were no random blows, no evidence of panic. Whoever had done this had taken their time. They knew exactly what they were doing. As the investigation began, detectives started with the basics. Who was Daniel Harper? He had grown up in a nearby town, graduated from college, and moved to the city for work. He had no criminal record, no known enemies, and no history of dangerous behavior. His social circle was small, a few co-workers, a couple of old friends he met occasionally, and neighbors who described him as polite but distant. The apartment itself offered few clues. No valuables were missing. His wallet, phone, and keys were all accounted for. The kitchen showed signs that dinner had been prepared, but never eaten. A single plate sat on the counter, untouched. It suggested that Daniel had been interrupted by someone he trusted enough to let inside, or by someone who was already there. Detectives canvassed the building. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. No loud arguments, no suspicious noises. One neighbor recalled hearing footsteps late at night, but thought nothing of it. In a place where people came and went at all hours, that detail felt frustratingly insignificant. As days passed, pressure mounted. Media coverage began to grow, focusing on the mystery rather than the victim. Investigators reviewed security footage from nearby streets and businesses. Most of it showed nothing more than passing cars and blurred figures. Then, on a camera across the street, they noticed something small but strange. A figure entered the building late at night, and did not appear to leave until early morning. The image was grainy, the face unclear. The person wore dark clothing and moved with confidence. Not like someone afraid of being seen. It was a lid, but not enough. Detectives needed more. They turned to Daniel's phone records and online activity. His last messages were mundane, conversations about work deadlines and weekend plans. There was no hint of fear or urgency, but one detail stood out. In the days before his death, Daniel had been exchanging messages with someone saved only as a first name, Alex. The conversations were polite, almost formal. They discussed meeting, helping each other with something unspecified. There was no argument, no obvious tension. When detectives tried to trace the number, they discovered it was prepaid and unregistered. Another dead end, or so it seemed. The autopsy report added a new layer to the mystery. The time of death placed the murder within a narrow window late at night. Toxicology results revealed traces of a sedative in Daniel's system. He had likely been incapacitated before he was killed. This explained the lack of struggle, but it raised a terrifying implication. Daniel had trusted someone enough to let them close enough to accept a drink, or medication, or something that made him vulnerable. Investigators began to rethink everything they thought they knew. This wasn't random. This was planned. They reconstructed Daniel's final day. Minute by minute, he had gone to work, returned home at his usual time, and made a quick stop at a local store. Surveillance footage showed him buying groceries. Nothing unusual. Then he went home. From that point on, the trail went cold. Detectives interviewed co-workers again, this time with sharper questions. One colleague mentioned that Daniel had recently seemed distracted, maybe nervous. Another recalled a conversation where Daniel hinted at a problem he was trying to resolve. No one knew what he meant. The case was starting to take a toll. Investigators worked long hours, replaying footage, rereading reports, chasing leads that went nowhere. The orderly crime scene, once seen as a clue, now felt like a mockery. It suggested intelligence, patience, and a chilling level of control. Then, nearly 3 weeks into the investigation, a break came from an unexpected place. A financial analyst reviewing Daniel's bank records noticed several small transactions that didn't fit his usual spending habits. They were payments to a storage facility on the edge of the city. Daniel had never mentioned owning extra storage, and none of his belongings suggested he needed one. When detectives visited the facility, they found a unit rented under Daniel's name. Inside were boxes filled with documents, old electronics, and personal files. At first glance, it looked like clutter. But as they dug deeper, they realized Daniel had been organizing information, notes, timelines, printed emails, all carefully arranged. It was as if he had been preparing for something. Among the papers was a name written repeatedly. Alex Monroe. The story continues. At first the name meant nothing, but when investigators ran it through databases, they found a match. Alex Monroe was not a criminal mastermind, or a wanted fugitive. On paper, Alex was unremarkable. Mid-30s freelance consultant, moved frequently, few long-term connections, no criminal record worth mentioning. The kind of person who could exist on the edges of other people's lives without drawing attention. Detectives began digging into the connection between Daniel and Alex. Email records revealed that they had met through a professional networking platform. What started as casual conversations had slowly become more frequent. Daniel seemed to be asking questions, probing gently, while Alex responded with vague but confident answers. There was no explicit threat, no obvious motive. As the investigation expanded, a pattern emerged. Alex had a history of attaching himself to people who lived alone, people with stable routines and predictable lives. In several previous cities, individuals connected to Alex had experienced sudden, unexplained crises. Not all of them were crimes, but the similarities were unsettling. When detectives finally located Alex, he was living under a slightly altered name in a neighboring state. He agreed to come in for questioning. Calm, cooperative, almost charming. Alex answered questions with ease. He admitted knowing Daniel, but described their relationship as strictly professional. When asked about the night of the murder, Alex claimed to be out of town. He even provided receipts and digital records to support his alibi. For a moment it seemed like the case might collapse under its own complexity. But investigators had learned to be patient. They examined Alex's alibi closely and found small inconsistencies. Timestamps that didn't quite align, a location ping that placed his phone near Daniel's apartment, just briefly, before disappearing. Confronted with these details, Alex didn't panic. Instead, he smiled faintly and suggested there must be a technical error. That reaction, more than anything else, sent a chill through the room. Forensic evidence finally tied everything together. Traces of the same sedative found in Daniel's system were discovered in Alex's possession, hidden among personal items. When pressed, Alex claimed it was for anxiety, but experts testified that the dosage and formulation matched what had been used on Daniel. The trial that followed captivated the public. Prosecutors lay. In the month that followed the verdict, the case continued to echo far beyond the courtroom. For the investigative team, there was no clean emotional ending, no sense of relief that people often expect once justice is served. Instead, there was a quiet exhaustion. Files were closed, desks were cleared, but the memory of that apartment, perfectly arranged and chillingly calm, stayed with them. Psychologists later analyzed the case as an example of calculated interpersonal crime, where manipulation mattered more than force. Alex Monroe had not relied on chaos or violence to overpower his victim. He relied on patience, on observation, on understanding how trust works and how easily it can be misused. That realization unsettled many professionals, because it suggested that warning signs are often subtle, almost invisible until it's too late. Friends of Daniel struggled with guilt. They replayed conversations in their minds, searching for moments they might have missed. A delayed reply, a distracted tone, a half-finished sentence that hinted at concern. Some remembered Daniel mentioning that he was sorting something out, but none had pushed him to explain. It wasn't neglect, just the ordinary assumption that adults can handle their own problems. After his death, that assumption felt heavier. The storage unit became a focal point of reflection. Investigators believed Daniel had sensed danger, but didn't fully understand it. He hadn't called the police. He hadn't confronted Alex directly. Instead, he quietly gathered information, perhaps hoping to make sense of things before acting. It was a tragic reminder that awareness doesn't always lead to safety, especially when the threat comes disguised as familiarity. Media attention slowly faded, as it always does. New cases replaced old headlines, but among law enforcement circles, the case was often referenced during training sessions, not because of its gore or drama, but because of its restraint. Trainees were told that crimes like this don't shout, they whisper. They hide behind routines, polite conversations, and believable excuses. Alex Monroe was sentenced to life imprisonment. During sentencing, he showed little emotion, no outburst, no visible remorse. When given a chance to speak, he declined. That silence became his final contribution to a case defined by what was left unsaid. Years later, when asked about the investigation, one detective described it as a lesson in humility. "We like to believe patterns always reveal themselves clearly," he said. "But sometimes the pattern is how normal everything looks." That statement captured the essence of the case more than any report ever could. Daniel's family chose privacy over publicity. They honored him quietly, focusing on memories untouched by violence. They spoke about his discipline, his kindness, his habit of checking in on people even when he kept his own struggles private. In doing so, they reclaimed his story from the shadows of the crime. What remains most disturbing about this case is not just what happened, but how easily it could have gone unnoticed. If Daniel had lived with someone else, if a neighbor had paid closer attention, if a single message had been sent at the right time, the outcome might have been different. Those possibilities linger like unanswered questions, impossible to resolve. For investigators, the phrase, "no signs of forced entry," took on new meaning. It reminded them that access doesn't always require a broken door. Sometimes it's given willingly, built slowly through conversation and perceived reliability. That understanding reshaped how future cases were approached, placing greater emphasis on psychological dynamics rather than physical evidence alone. In the end, this was not just a story about a murder. It was a story about trust, about how ordinary lives can intersect with hidden intentions. It was about the danger of assuming that familiarity equals safety, and about the quiet spaces where threats can grow unnoticed. The case left investigators in shock, not because of what they saw, but because of what they learned. That the most unsettling crimes are not always the loudest. Some are defined by stillness, by planning, and by the terrifying realization that the line between normal and dangerous is far thinner than we like to believe. And as the years pass, that lesson remains, lingering in the background of every routine check, every quiet apartment, and every case that seems too calm to question.